Hello everyone, welcome to today's session, Religions in Asia. So today the mini lecture basically is a very brief introduction of the different religions in Asia. Of course, I cannot go over all the different religions in a 20 minutes mini lecture, so I provide more materials after this mini lecture to let you have a general understanding of these religions. First, let's talk about Hinduism. Hinduism is the world's third largest religion. It is an Indian religion or way of life, which means it is also kind of a social practices. Hinduism is widely practiced in the Indian subcontinent and parts of Southeast Asia. Basically, it's quite limited in these areas. That's why we cannot say it as a global religion. Hinduism has been called the oldest religion in the world. The name basically means the eternal tradition or the eternal way beyond human history. Most scholars regard Hinduism as a fusion or synthesis of various Indian cultures and traditions with diverse roots, and there is no founder of this religion. Very different from Christianity or Islam. This Hindu synthesis started to develop between 500 BCE and 300 BCE, after the end of the Vedic period, and flourished in the medieval period with the decline of Buddhism in India. We have to keep in mind that the caste system and Hinduism are related to each other. So here it refers to another concept, jati. Jati basically is a caste group or a community. In South Asia today, there are still many thousands of caste communities. So members of each jati are connected by occupation. They tend to marry only fellow jati members. So in general, a caste is an endogamous hereditary group of families bearing a common name, often claiming a common descent. As a rule, professing to follow the same hereditary calling, adhering to the same customs, especially regarding purity, meals, and marriages. So the variant of castes was more like a social practice. So according to Hinduism, caste can still be transcended by religious devotion, which again emphasizes its non-religious nature. There is only one exception, that beyond caste is the holy man. So this picture showed 3 holy men in today's India. The Vedas is the religious text collection of Hinduism. So Vedic religion was already a mixture of Harappan, Aryan, and Dravidian elements. The most important concept of Hinduism is reincarnation. This is a philosophical but also a religious concept that the non-physical essence of a living being starts a new life in a different physical form or body after biological death. It is also called rebirth or transmigration. So in Hinduism, there is no beginning, no end. Life is a circle. For more details about Hinduism, please watch the video of the introduction of Hinduism. Now let's look at Buddhism. So Buddhism is a religion and philosophy that developed from the teachings of the Buddha His original name was Siddhartha Gautama. But Buddha in Sanskrit, it means the awakened one. He's a teacher, lived in northern India between the middle 6th and the mid 4th centuries BCE. Buddhism was the world's fourth largest religion. Comparing to Hinduism, it's more global because it spread to China, to Tibet, Japan, Korea, and today in the West world, the United States, etc. Ideas of Buddhism was widely spread because people at that time they rejected existing caste distinctions and wanted to find something beyond daily sufferings because they could not find a channel to overcome all the difficulties and sufferings in their real life. There are two major branches in Buddhism. First is the Theravada, which means the school of the elders. Theravada was the form of Buddhism transmitted to Southeast Asia, where especially in Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, and also Sri Lanka, it has remained the dominant religion and it's still taken very seriously by most of the people of those countries. So basically all young men, they had to spend 2 years in Buddhist temples, monasteries, as many still do, with shaven heads, a yellow robe, and a begging bowl. As adults, they and most others pay far more than lip service to the Theravada version of the path. Another branch is Mahayana, which means the great vehicle. It was developed a little later. It's more popularized, humanized, and provide with a variety of supports, including the worship of relics. It spread more widely than the Theravada. It was carried by the monks to China, Tibet, Korea, and Japan. The main idea of the Buddhism are the Four Noble Truths. The first one is life is filled with pain, sorrow, frustration, impermanence, and dissatisfaction. Second, all this is caused by desire, by wanting, and by the urge for existence. For example, you always want more clothes, more money. That is the root of your sorrow. Third, to end suffering and sorrow, one must end his or her desire, become a desireless person. At last, desirelessness can be gained by the eightfold path of right conduct. So the right conduct includes like kindness to all living things, purity of heart, honesty, truthfulness, charity, etc. When Hinduism and Buddhism flourished in Indian subcontinent, in China, people also developed their own different kinds of philosophies. So basically, at that time, it was the golden age of human thoughts. We can see different philosophers in Greece, in Europe. It's just a golden age of all these different philosophies. So Confucius, he was one of the first men of ideas. He was a young man, served in the court of his hometown. But he did not gain much influence in his hometown. Then he left his hometown Lu, set out with a small band of students, and wandered through neighboring states in search of a proper ruler who would take his advice. Confucius' ideas are known to us primarily through the things recorded by his disciples in the Analects. The thrust of his thought was ethical rather than theoretical or metaphysical. He talked repeatedly of an ideal age when everyone was devoted to fulfilling his or her rule. Superiors looked after those dependent on them. Inferiors devoted themselves to the service of their superiors. Parents and children, husbands and wives, masters and servants, all wholeheartedly embraced what was expected of them. Another important concept of Confucianism is the value of family. Confucius considered the family the basic unit of a society. Filial piety was appreciated of Confucianism. So filial piety means reverent attitude of children to their parents. My favorite idea of Confucianism is to be a gentleman or to be a 君子 or gentlewoman. So in Confucianism, the ideal personality is sage. However, sagehood is hard to attain, and so Confucius created the 君子 gentleman, which more individual could achieve. Basically, it's a person with all those good personalities, honest, brave, etc. Even if you are alone, no one could see you or hear you, you still have to maintain the noble personality and do the goods. So Confucianism it is difficult to say it is a religion. It's more like a collection of different philosophies. So this is it's a current temple of Confucianism. So Kongzi, he is not considered as a god. He is not, able to do everything. He's more like a true gentleman, give people advice and teaching people. At the same time of the development of Confucianism, Taoism also appeared. So Confucius and his followers believed in moral efforts and statecraft. They thought men of virtue should devote themselves to making the government work to the benefit of the people. But the Taoists, they disagreed. They thought striving to make things better generally made them worse. So Taoists defended private life and wanted the rulers to leave the people alone. They sought to go beyond everyday concerns and to let their minds wander freely. Rather than making human beings and human actions the center of concern, they focused on the large scheme of things, the whole natural order, identified as the way, or Dao. So Dao means the way, but it's a very abstract concept. Two people are very important for the development of Taoism. The first one is Lao Tzu. So Lao Tzu wrote the book of the Way, or Dao De Jing. So what is Dao, or what is the way? To Lao Tzu, it's a very abstract concept. So here is his explanation. The way that can be discussed is not the constant way. And then he used a metaphor to explain the way. The highest good is like water. Water benefits all creatures, but it does not compete. It occupies the places people disdain, and thus comes near to the way. I'm also a martial arts lover. I'm not sure if you ever heard about Bruce Lee's quote. I think it also explains well of the way of martial art. You must be shapeless, formless, like water. Another important philosopher of Daoism is Zhuangzi. You probably heard about the butterfly story. The butterfly dream is the most famous story in Zhuangzi. So here is the story. Once Zhuangzi dreamed he was a butterfly fleeting and fluttering around, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He didn't know he was Zhuangzi. Suddenly he woke up, and there he was, solid and unmistakable Zhuangzi. But he didn't know if he were Zhuangzi, who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was Zhuangzi. Between Zhuangzi and a butterfly, there must be some distinction. This is called the transformation of things. So here we can see there is no clear distinction between his dream and the reality, and there is no way he can tell what is real and what is the dream. Another important philosophy is showed in this picture, the yin and yang. Confucians, Daoists, and the legalists, they all paid attention to the yin and yang idea, but I think Daoism particularly emphasized the transformation between yin and yang. So yin and yang was first described in a book called the Book of Changes. According to the book, yin is the more feminine, dark, receptive, yielding, negative, and weak. Yang is the masculine, bright, assertive, creative, positive, and strong. But remember, yin and yang are complementary poles rather than distinct entities or opposing forces. These models based on observation of nature were extended to explain not only phenomena we might classify as natural, such as illness, storms, and earthquakes, but also social phenomena such as the rise and fall of states and conflicts in families. Yin and yang, they are not like totally different from each other. There is always a trend to transform to each other. So in all these realms, unwanted things happen when the balance between yin and yang gets disturbed. So in order to keep the balance, you cannot just emphasize one perspective. You have to maintain the harmony and keep the balance of the whole society or the body or the nature. So after this mini lecture, I also give you a link of one of my favorite philosophy professor, Pute. So he talks about the relationships between Confucianism and some basic ideas of Daoism. You can hear about the butterfly story again from his speech. Now let's look at Islam in Asia. Islam is the youngest of the great world religions. The founder of Islam, Muhammad, also spelled Muhammad. He was born into a prosperous merchant family at Mecca in Arabia about 570 BCE. 570 CE. So he was a young man and entered the family business and served for a time as a camel driver and trader. But he became distressed about the social injustice and corruption that he found in Mecca. His preaching against these evils attracted few supporters. He moved some 200 miles north to the town of Medina in 622. a journey known as the Hijra, which is still used to mark the first year of the Muslim era, or Year of the Prophet. Muhammad, his preaching centered on the affirmation of the one God, Allah, as opposed to the many nature spirits of the animistic tribal religion of his own at earlier times in Arabia. At his new base in Medina, he established a religious community and further developed his teachings. From this period, there emerged the Quran, the principal sacred text of Islam, probably completed after his death. Muhammad and his followers believed that the Quran was inspired by God and therefore represented the direct words of Allah and communicated directly to Muhammad, his messenger. As such, not a word could be changed, at least for the first few centuries. However, from the beginning, the text was accompanied by commentaries explaining and interpreting the supposedly divinely dictated text, a practice that continued in subsequent centuries. The version compiled in the 13th century remains the standard for modern Orthodox Muslims. Although it originated in Arabia and still dominates the Middle East as a whole and parts of Africa, Islam was carried to India and from there to Malaya, Indonesia, and the southern Philippines, as well as into northwestern China via Central Asia by the Silk Road, which we will discuss later. Since about the 18th century, Indonesia has in fact been the country with the largest population of Muslims in the world. The spreading of Islam is mostly carried by the merchants because the Muslims are famous for their talents of doing business as their profit. There are some rituals of Islam. So during one is the pilgrimage or Hajj. So during the believer's lifetime, the faithful must also make a pilgrimage or Hajj to Mecca and Medina, the sacred places of Islam. The Quran also sanctions holy war, jihad against unbelievers, and the killing of infidels. Although, like all religions, Islam's basic message is one of charity, peace, and love. Okay, I'm not going to talk more about the details of Islam, but here is one architecture in Asia, the Masjid, the Maqam of Pink Mosque. It's in today's Philippines. So the pink color symbolizes peace and love, as well as unity and interfaith brotherhood. At the end of today's lecture, let's talk about Shinto in Japan. Ritual practices in early Japan centered around the worship of nature were later called Shinto, which means the way of the gods, primarily to distinguish them from Buddhist practices when Buddhism reached Japan. So Shinto, probably a consolidation of local nature worship cults, has remained in contemporary Japan as a particularly Japanese religion, with its own priesthood and temples inspired by the Buddhist example, but quite distinctive otherwise. So there are always the debates about whether Shinto is a cult or a religion. Shinto has never been an organized body of thought or even what we might call religion. It never developed a clear moral code, or coherent philosophy, but did preserve early notions of ritual purity. For instance, physical dirt, death, childbirth, illness, menstruation, and sexual intercourse were all seen as pollution, as polluting, and had to be ceremonially cleansed or exorcised by a priest. Priests also acted as diviners and mediums, like the shamans of Korea and China. All over Japan, you can still see beautiful Shinto shrines. Beautiful not only because they celebrate nature and because they are located in natural beauty spots, but also because of their classically simple architectural style. Most of the shrines are surrounded by tall trees. Others are tiny things the size of a large birdhouse, with natural bark-covered roofs dotted in the mountains, far from human habitation. This is one famous shrine, the Itsukushima Shrine Torii in Hiroshima Prefecture. So basically, this is the entrance of the shrine. You probably remember we all have a final project of Asian culture. So last year, one student, Shim, used Lego blocks, made this shrine, which is very beautiful, and I like this idea. Okay, thank you very much for listening to today's lecture.